Everyone had given up on Jim Springer. His doctors. His staff. His own son. He'd made peace with dying alone, until a little girl in a yellow dress knelt beside his wheelchair, took his trembling hand, and said the one sentence no one had said to him in 15 years, "I'll stay until you smile again." The library was dark the way a grave is dark, deliberately, permanently, on purpose. Jim Springer sat in his wheelchair facing the cold fireplace, back to the door when he heard the small footsteps. Too light to be staff. Too unafraid to be anyone who worked for him, because everyone who worked for him had long ago learned to move through this house like they were trespassing in their own lives. "Who's there?" he said. It wasn't a question. Questions require curiosity, and Jim had run out of that years ago. "I'm Lily." He turned the wheelchair slowly, the way old men turn everything slowly now, like the world owes them nothing quick. A little girl stood in the doorway in a yellow dress, a sketchbook tucked under one arm, sunlight from the hallway spilling in around her like she'd brought it with her. "How did you get in here?" "I followed the pretty hallway." "You shouldn't be here." "I know. Children aren't allowed." "I know that too." She said it the way children say true things, without shame, without apology, just fact. Then she walked closer instead of away, which no one had done in years. Not the doctors. Not his lawyers. Not his own son. She knelt by the wheelchair and placed both small hands over his, which trembled the way hands do when a heart has decided it's almost finished with its work. "Why do you keep all the curtains closed?" she asked. "Because I don't want sunshine." "Why?" "Because I'm waiting to die." Lily considered this the way children consider things, completely, without flinching, without the polite horror an adult would have performed. "I don't think people waiting to die need a library full of books nobody reads," she said. "I think they need someone to hold their hand." Jim Springer, 79 years old, worth more money than most countries, felt something crack open in his chest that no cardiologist had ever found on a scan. "I'll stay," Lily said, "until you smile again." Have you ever wondered whether the smallest person in a house could carry the weight the whole family had given up on? Because you're about to watch it happen. Stay until the end. The secret inside Jim Springer's locked wooden box is going to break your heart open in a way you won't see coming. 3 days earlier, the apartment had smelled like old carpet and a landlord's final warning. Rachel Walsh sat on the kitchen floor, if you could call a hot plate and a mini fridge a kitchen, counting coins she already knew wouldn't be enough. $43.12. Rent was 4 days overdue. The eviction notice was folded twice in her back pocket, pressed against her hip like a bruise she hadn't earned but had to carry anyway. 6-year-old Lily sat beside her, sketchbook open on her lap, crayon moving in slow, careful circles. "That's us, Mama," Lily said, not looking up. A house. A yellow sun. 2 stick figures holding hands in a doorway. "One day we'll live somewhere like this." Rachel touched one of Lily's loose braids and didn't trust her voice enough to answer right away. The elastic had slipped again. She'd need to redo it in the morning, the way she redid so many small things every single day, quietly, so Lily never noticed how much of their life was held together by her mother simply refusing to let it fall apart. "One day, baby," Rachel finally said. The call came that evening. A home care agency, a voice reading from a script it had clearly given up believing in. "We have one placement," the woman said. "Private estate. Live-in position. Elderly male patient, end-stage heart disease. I should tell you up front, 12 caregivers have already left this placement in under a year. Mr. Springer is difficult. Deliberately so. He doesn't want help. He wants to be left alone long enough to die in peace, and he's very good at arranging that." "Does the position include housing?" Rachel asked, though she already knew the answer mattered more than anything else the woman could say next. "Full room and board." Rachel closed her eyes. Room and board. 2 words that tasted, right then, like air after drowning. "One more thing," the woman continued, her voice dropping slightly, like she was bracing for the answer to matter. "Mr. Springer's contract is explicit. No children on the property. None. Not even for a visit." Rachel looked at Lily, drawing her impossible yellow house at the kitchen table. She looked at the eviction notice burning against her hip. "I understand," Rachel said. We'll be there tomorrow. That night she packed everything they owned into 2 bags. It didn't take long. Lily watched from the mattress, hugging her sketchbook to her chest like it might float away if she let go. Are we going to a big house, Mama? A very big house. Will there be a garden? I think so. Will there be a nice man there? Rachel thought of the woman's voice on the phone, cruel, deliberately, and smiled anyway because some lies are just love wearing a disguise. We'll find out, she said. What Rachel didn't know, couldn't have known, was that behind the iron gates of the Springer estate, a bitter old man was sitting in the dark holding a photograph he hadn't looked at in 50 years. And the woman in that photograph looked exactly like the little girl who was about to walk through his front door. The next morning, Jim watched from an upstairs window as a battered sedan pulled up the long gravel drive. A tired-looking woman stepped out first. Then a small girl in a yellow dress climbed out after her, spinning once in the sunlight like the world hadn't taught her yet that it could be cruel. Jim's hand tightened on the windowsill. For one impossible second he thought he was looking at a ghost. The Springer estate did not feel like a home. It felt like a museum that had given up expecting visitors. Rachel spent her first days learning its silence. Covered furniture sat in wings of the house no one had entered in years. Curtains had been nailed shut in certain rooms, as if sunlight itself had once done something unforgivable. Staff moved through the hallways in a hush, the way people move through a hospital at night, careful not to wake something that was better left asleep. Jim Springer humiliated her without effort, the way a man does when cruelty has become the only language he trusts. The coffee was too weak. The blanket was the wrong weight. The room was too warm and then within the hour too cold. Nothing pleased him, and Rachel began to understand that nothing was supposed to. His unhappiness wasn't a complaint to be solved. It was a wall he'd built brick by brick, and he intended to keep building it until there was no one left standing on the other side. Rachel never argued. She had learned long ago, in a life that had handed her far more practice at swallowing pride than she would have chosen, that some battles cost more than their worth. She needed this job the way a drowning person needs air, not dignity, and dignity could wait. Lily, meanwhile, discovered the mansion the way only a child can, completely, joyfully, without asking permission from anyone, least of all fear. She found a piano gone silent under a heavy dust sheet, its keys yellowed like old teeth. She found an abandoned greenhouse, glass cracked in a dozen places, vines gone brown and brittle where flowers used to climb. She found a library taller than any room she'd ever stood inside, more books than she'd known existed in one place, stacked floor to ceiling like the house itself was trying to hide behind them. And one afternoon, wandering the opposite direction from a locked door she'd been warned about, she ended up somewhere far more dangerous than any locked room, Jim Springer's private study. That was the afternoon everything changed. The conversation that had already broken open in a stranger's mind, the one that would one day become the opening the whole world remembered this story by, now played out in full, in real time in the dim afternoon light. The girl who wasn't afraid, the old man who couldn't remember the last time someone had touched him with kindness instead of obligation. I'll stay until you smile again, Lily told him, her small hand still resting over his. Jim did not smile. Not that day. But he did not send her away either, and for a man who had made an art form of sending everyone away, that alone was its own kind of miracle. Quiet, unannounced, the sort of miracle that doesn't look like one until much later. That night, after Lily had gone to bed in the small room off the servants' quarters that Rachel had made as warm and hidden as she could manage, Jim wheeled himself to his desk. He opened a drawer he rarely touched anymore, one that stuck slightly from disuse. Inside, folded carefully, corners smoothed flat by small fingers, was a crayon drawing Lily had left behind on the study floor. A house, a yellow sun, 2 stick figures standing together beneath it. He sat with it for a long time. He thought about throwing it away the way he threw away most things that asked something of him. Sentiment. Softness. Hope, which he had decided decades ago was simply grief that hadn't happened yet. Instead, he opened the drawer wider, moved aside an old fountain pen he no longer used, and placed the drawing inside, flat and careful, the way a man places something he isn't ready to admit matters to him. Outside his window, the estate sat in its usual darkness. But inside that drawer, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something had survived the night without being thrown away. Rachel didn't know yet what her daughter had started. She only knew that when she came to collect Lily from outside the study door that evening, the old man in the wheelchair hadn't shouted for the child to be removed. He had simply watched her go, silent, his eyes following the small yellow dress down the hallway until it disappeared around the corner. The head housekeeper, a stern woman named Doris who had survived longer at the estate than almost anyone by keeping her head down and her opinions to herself, pulled Rachel aside the next morning. "You need to keep that child away from him," Doris said, glancing over her shoulder out of habit more than necessity. "You know the rule. If he decides to enforce it, you lose everything. Not just the job. The room. The both of you would be back on the street inside the hour." "I know," Rachel said quietly. "Then why haven't you stopped her?" Rachel didn't have an answer that would have made sense to Doris, or to anyone else in that house who had learned to survive Jim Springer by staying small and invisible. The truth was that she'd seen something in him yesterday in the doorway of that study that she hadn't seen in any of the staff's warnings or the agency's script. She'd seen a man look at her daughter the way a drowning man looks at a rope he isn't sure he's allowed to grab. She didn't stop Lily. She told herself it was because she couldn't, that a 6-year-old went where a 6-year-old wanted to go regardless of what her mother said. But some nights, lying awake in the small room off the servants' quarters, she suspected the truer reason was that some part of her didn't want to. By the end of that first week, the staff had started to notice small things shifting in the house's rhythm. Jim requested his meals a few minutes earlier, as though he had somewhere to be. He stopped sending back the tea. Once, Doris swore she heard him humming, actually humming low and off-key, from behind the closed study door, and she'd stood frozen in the hallway for a full minute afterward, unsure whether to be relieved or alarmed. Rachel noticed it too, in her own quiet way, cataloging each small change the way she cataloged everything now out of long habit, carefully without comment, filing it away as something that might matter later, though she couldn't yet have said how. Lily visited every day after that, the way children return to the things that make sense to them, without needing a reason beyond wanting to. She brought crayons in a battered tin box. She brought storybooks with cracked spines, borrowed from the library shelves twice her height. She read to Jim in the mismatched, sounding-out cadence of a 6-year-old working through big words one careful syllable at a time, and somehow it became the first thing in years that made the silence of that house feel like company instead of punishment. Jim began eating more. Small things at first, a few extra bites of soup, a piece of toast he would have once sent back untouched. He walked a little further with his cane before the pain forced him back into the chair, testing the edges of his own body the way a man testing whether an old bridge might still hold his weight. Once, only once, but the staff noticed, and word of it moved through the house like sunlight finally reaching a room that had been dark for years. He laughed. It startled even him, the sound of it, unfamiliar in his own throat. Rachel noticed too. She said nothing about it directly, only watched from doorways and hallway corners as a man everyone in that house had quietly written off began, slowly and without fanfare, to come back to life. She recognized something in it she didn't have words for yet, something that felt dangerously close to hope, which she had learned to be careful with. Then his son Richard visited. Richard did not sit. He stood near the doorway of his father's study in an expensive coat he never removed, as if he intended to leave the moment the conversation stopped being useful to him. He did not ask how his father felt. He asked about the trust documents, about the estate's current valuation, about whether the will had been reviewed recently and by whom. Lily, watching from the doorway with the fearless honesty only children carry before the world teaches them to soften their questions, asked the thing the whole room was clearly too polite to ask out loud. "Why doesn't your son hug you?" The room went still. Richard glanced at her the way a man glances at an insect that has wandered somewhere it doesn't belong. Jim said nothing. He looked at his hands instead, the same hands Lily had been holding all week, and said nothing at all. Richard left shortly after, without answering either, his footsteps fading down the hallway with the particular briskness of a man who had somewhere more important to be. That night, from the hallway outside the study, Rachel heard Richard's voice through a half-closed door, low and clipped, speaking to someone on the phone. "He's getting stronger," he said. "That's a problem. We need to talk. Soon." Rachel stood frozen for a moment, one hand against the cool wall, unsure what exactly she had just overheard, only certain that it wasn't meant for her ears, and that whatever it meant, it wasn't good. She didn't understand the shape of the danger yet. She only knew, with the particular instinct mothers develop when something in a house shifts in a way they can't name, that something had changed. That night, back in the small room off the servants' quarters, she held Lily a little tighter than usual as the girls slept, and didn't sleep herself for a long while after. The following morning, Jim asked Rachel to sit with him for the first time since she'd arrived. Not to correct her, not to complain about the temperature of his room, but simply to talk. It unsettled her more than his cruelty ever had, because she didn't yet know what to do with a version of him that wasn't sharpened into a weapon. "Your daughter asked me something yesterday I haven't been able to stop thinking about," he said, staring out the window at the overgrown gardens. "She asked why my son doesn't hug me. Do you know what I told her?" "What did you tell her?" "Nothing. I didn't have an answer." He turned his wheelchair slightly toward her. "I've spent my whole life believing that love was something you earned through what you built, through what you left behind. I never once considered that maybe it doesn't work that way, that maybe it never did." Rachel didn't know what to say to that, so she said the only honest thing she had. "I think Lily believes people deserve kindness whether they've earned it or not. I used to think that was naive. Lately I'm not so sure." Jim didn't respond, but something in his face shifted, some old certainty quietly cracking loose from its foundation. Later that week, Lily convinced Jim to let her push his wheelchair, just once, just to the end of the hallway and back, insisting she was strong enough even though she clearly wasn't and had to lean her whole small body into it to get the wheels moving. Jim let her try anyway, gripping the armrests, holding back a laugh he hadn't expected to feel rising in his chest. "You're going too slow," Lily complained, huffing with effort. "I'm an old man in a wheelchair," Jim said. "Slow is the only speed I have left." "That's not true," Lily said, stopping to catch her breath, hands on her hips in a gesture so exactly like her mother's that Jim almost said so out loud. "You walked further yesterday than you did the day before. Rachel told me. That means you're getting faster. You just don't notice it because you're always looking at what you can't do instead of what you can." Jim stared at her for a long moment, this 6-year-old delivering him a piece of wisdom sharper than anything his doctors, his lawyers, or his own reflection had managed to offer him in years. "Where did you learn to talk like that?" he asked. "I don't know," Lily said, shrugging, already moving to push the wheelchair again. "I just say what I notice." That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Jim sat by his window longer than usual, turning her words over. He thought about how long he'd spent cataloging his own decline instead of whatever ground he'd managed to hold. He thought about how easily a child could see past 50 years of carefully built bitterness to the small, stubborn will still fighting somewhere underneath it. Outside, the estate sat in its familiar darkness, but somewhere inside it, a clock had quietly started counting down toward something none of them could see coming yet. The storm arrived without warning, the way the worst ones always do, rolling over the estate in the deep hours of the night until the windows rattled and the old trees along the drive bent low under the wind. Power failed across the property first, plunging the great house into a darkness even deeper than its usual gloom. The emergency generator, meant to carry the medical equipment through exactly this kind of night, sputtered twice and then died completely, its failing hum the last sound before true silence took over. And in that sudden dark, Jim Springer's heart gave out. Rachel heard it before she understood it, a crash, a ragged gasp, the sound of a body sliding from a chair to the floor. She ran the length of the hallway with her phone already in her hand, only to find no signal at all, the storm having taken the lines down along with the power. There was no ambulance coming. Not tonight, not through roads already flooding under the weight of the rain. Rachel dropped to her knees beside him and began CPR, counting under her breath, her arms burning within seconds, refusing to stop. She called for Richard on the landline the moment it flickered briefly back to life, and he did not answer. Not once. Not in the 20 minutes that followed. Lily knelt beside them both in the dark, her small hands gripping the sleeve of Jim's cardigan, refusing to let go even as Rachel worked over him. "Don't leave me, Grandpa," she said over and over, her voice steady in a way that no child's voice should have to be. "Don't leave me, Grandpa. Don't leave me." When Jim's breath finally caught, ragged but present, Rachel didn't wait for the storm to pass. She half-carried, half-guided him to the car, Lily climbing into the back beside him without being asked, still holding his hand, still talking to him in a low steady stream of words meant to keep him tethered to the world a little longer. The roads out of the estate were already flooding in places, water pooling deep enough to stall lesser cars. Rachel drove through it anyway, both hands locked on the wheel, jaw set, refusing to let her fears slow her down even once. They reached the hospital with minutes to spare. 5 more minutes, the doctor told Rachel quietly in the hallway afterward, once Jim had been stabilized, once the machines around him had settled into their steady, reassuring rhythm. 5 more minutes and we would have lost him. Rachel sat in a hard plastic hospital chair long after Lily had fallen asleep against her shoulder, utterly wrung out, replaying the last hour over and over. She thought of Richard's unanswered phone. She thought of the ragged sound of Jim's breathing in the dark. She thought of her daughter's small hands gripping an old man's sleeve like she had personally decided he was not allowed to leave this world tonight. And somewhere in the exhausted quiet of that hallway, without ever having intended to, Rachel understood that she had become something to this family she had never expected to belong to at all. Outside, the storm slowly wore itself out over the hospital parking lot, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, Jim Springer was still breathing when the sun came up. A nurse found Rachel in the hallway near dawn and gently suggested she go home to rest, that visiting hours technically hadn't started and that family members were normally asked to wait in the lobby. "I'm not family," Rachel said, too exhausted to soften it. "I'm his housekeeper." The nurse glanced through the doorway at Lily, still asleep with her small hand wrapped around Jim's fingers even in her sleep, and then back at Rachel. "Could have fooled me," she said, and let the matter drop. When Jim finally woke fully, groggy and disoriented under the fluorescent lights, the first thing he did was search the room until his eyes found Lily's small shape curled in the chair beside him. "She stayed?" he asked, his voice raw and unfamiliar to his own ears. "She wouldn't leave," Rachel said. "Neither would I if I'm honest." Jim closed his eyes again, not from exhaustion this time, but because he didn't trust what his face might do if he kept them open. 12 caregivers had walked away from him in less than a year. His own son hadn't answered a single call during the worst night of his life. And yet here was a woman who owed him nothing beyond a paycheck, sitting in a hard plastic chair through a storm and a flood and a near death, because she had decided, somewhere along the way, that he was worth staying for. He didn't say thank you. He didn't yet have the words for something that large. But when Rachel reached over to adjust his blanket, he let his hand rest briefly over hers, and for the first time since she'd arrived at the estate, neither of them pulled away. Later that morning, a doctor came in to review his chart and paused, frowning slightly at something in the notes. "Mr. Springer, your discharge paperwork lists your emergency contact as your son. Given last night, I'd recommend updating that." "He wasn't reachable at all?" "Not once," Jim said flatly. The doctor glanced toward Rachel, who was helping Lily fold a blanket in the corner of the room. "Who brought you in?" "She did," Jim said, nodding toward Rachel. "Both of them did." The doctor made a note, and something about the simple administrative act of it, crossing out one name and writing in another, struck Jim harder than he expected. 50 years of building an empire, and the name that mattered in the moment his heart actually stopped belonged to a woman he'd hired 3 weeks earlier and a child who wasn't supposed to be allowed on his property at all. When they finally returned to the estate 2 days later, Doris met them at the door, wringing her hands, clearly unsure whether to expect praise or blame for how the household had handled itself in his absence. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked. Jim looked past her toward the staircase, where Lily was already racing ahead toward the study, sketchbook under her arm, entirely undeterred by the fact that she'd nearly watched him die 3 nights earlier. "Everything's fine, Doris," he said, and meant it in a way he hadn't meant much of anything in a very long time. The hospital waiting room filled quickly the next morning with relatives Jim barely recognized, cousins and second cousins he hadn't spoken to in years, All of them dressed like they'd come from somewhere important, all of them talking in low, urgent voices the moment they thought no one was listening. None of them asked how he felt. They asked about stock ownership, about trust structures and beneficiary designations, about who would serve as executor if things went a certain way, and how quickly certain transfers could be processed if they needed to be. Jim lay in the hospital bed listening to it all through a half-open door, and understood, with a clarity that hurt worse than the heart attack itself, exactly what his life had been reduced to in the eyes of the people who shared his blood. Then Lily arrived, holding Rachel's hand, carrying another drawing rolled carefully in her small fist so it wouldn't crease. She unrolled it at his bedside. 3 figures standing beneath a bright yellow sun, Jim, Rachel, and herself holding hands. At the top, in careful, uneven letters, she had written 2 words, "My grandpa." Jim cried. Quietly, but he cried, tears sliding down into the creases of a face that hadn't allowed itself this particular vulnerability since his wife had died 15 years earlier. He didn't try to hide it from Lily, and Lily didn't look away from it either. She simply climbed carefully onto the edge of the bed and sat beside him until it passed. Rachel, meanwhile, had begun noticing something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with fear. The medication delivered to Jim's room didn't always match what the chart listed. The dosages shifted in ways that didn't track with his recovery. And each time, without fail, the changes seemed to follow closely on the heels of a family visit. Richard's most often, though never only his. She said nothing yet, not to Jim, not to the nurses, not even to herself in any way she was ready to fully admit. She only began watching more closely, cataloging small details the way a person does when their instincts insist something is wrong long before their mind is ready to accept why. That night, once Lily had fallen asleep in the chair beside Jim's bed and the hallway outside had gone quiet, Rachel stood alone by the medication cart for a long moment, her phone in her hand, her heart pounding harder than it had any right to over something she couldn't yet prove. She photographed the bottles anyway. Quietly, quickly, unsure exactly what she was documenting, only certain that whatever it turned out to be, someone needed a record of it before it disappeared. She slipped her phone back into her pocket and returned to Jim's bedside, sitting in the dark beside the 2 people who had somehow, in the space of a few short weeks, become the only family she had left in the world worth protecting. Outside the window, the city lights blinked on in the distance, indifferent to everything happening inside that small hospital room, and Rachel sat with her suspicion sitting heavy and unspoken in her chest, waiting for the right moment to finally say it out loud. Earlier that day, one of the cousins had cornered her near the vending machines, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "You've done well for yourself," the cousin said, looking Rachel up and down. Housekeeper to hospital bedside companion. Quite the promotion. "I'm just doing my job," Rachel said carefully. "Of course you are." The cousin's smile thinned. "Just remember, when this is over, whichever way it goes, people like you don't usually end up part of the story. You end up a footnote. A line item in someone else's will if you're lucky." Rachel said nothing, because there was nothing to say to someone who had already decided who she was before she'd opened her mouth. She walked away with the vending machine coffee going cold in her hand and found Lily asleep against Jim's shoulder in the hospital bed, his arm curled protectively around her small frame even in his own weakened state, and she understood, with sudden clarity, that whatever these relatives thought of her didn't matter nearly as much as what was actually happening in that room. She thought of the eviction notice still folded in the bottom of her bag, a life she'd almost lost completely. She thought of the medication bottles she'd photographed the night before, evidence of something she still couldn't quite believe a family would do to one of their own. And she thought of Lily's drawing, taped now to the wall beside Jim's bed where a nurse had put it at his request. 3 figures under a yellow sun, a family that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with who had actually shown up. A nurse pulled her aside quietly near the end of visiting hours, glancing toward the hallway before she spoke. "I don't usually say anything," the nurse said, "but I've worked this floor a long time, and I've seen a lot of families sit around a lot of hospital beds. Most of them are waiting for something. It's not always obvious what, but you can feel it in a room, the difference between people who are waiting for someone to get better and people who are waiting for something else." She glanced back toward Jim's room. Whatever's going on with his medication charts, I get answers before he goes home. Just trust what you're seeing." Rachel thanked her, throat tight, and returned to Jim's room to find Lily had woken and climbed fully into the bed beside him, both of them looking through an old photo one of the nurses had found tucked into his wallet. A young Jim, no older than 20, standing beside a woman in a housekeeper's uniform, neither of them smiling for the camera, both of them looking like they knew something the photograph itself couldn't capture. "Is that your mom?" Lily asked. Jim didn't answer right away. "Yes," he finally said. "That's my mother." Rachel stood in the doorway, unnoticed, watching the two of them lean over the photograph together, and felt the weight of everything she still hadn't said pressing harder against her chest, waiting for the moment she'd finally have the courage or the proof to say it out loud. Once Jim was moved back to the estate to recover, Rachel spent her free hours quietly digging through what records she could access. Pharmacy printouts left carelessly on the kitchen counter, medical charts glimpsed over a nurse's shoulder, dosage schedules that never quite matched what she remembered being told. Piece by piece, a pattern began to take shape, one she didn't want to believe even as the evidence kept accumulating in her favor. Meanwhile, Lily found Jim in his study one afternoon, sitting with the locked wooden box in his lap, staring at it the way a person stares at something they've spent a lifetime avoiding and finally run out of road to keep avoiding it on. "What's inside?" she asked, climbing up onto the chair beside him without waiting for permission, the way she'd stopped waiting for permission around him weeks ago. For the first time in 50 years, Jim told someone the truth. He hadn't been born into wealth, he said. His mother, Elena, had worked as a live-in housekeeper her entire life, scrubbing floors in other people's mansions from before dawn until well past dark, so that her son could go to school, could dream of something larger than the poverty she'd been born into and never fully escaped herself. She had worn the same apron for years until it was more patched than fabric. She had gone without so that he wouldn't have to. When Jim finally made his fortune, he did something he had never told another living soul. He erased every trace of where he'd come from. He changed his associations, his friendships, the careful shape of the story he told about his own beginnings, until the son of a housekeeper had vanished so completely that no one, not his colleagues, not his wife, not even his own son, ever knew the truth of who had raised him or what she had sacrificed to do it. The wooden box was all that remained of her. Letters in her careful, uneven handwriting. Photographs gone soft and creased at the corners. Her old apron, folded with a tenderness he hadn't allowed himself in decades. A silver locket she had worn every single day of her life, the clasp worn smooth from her thumb. "I didn't hate other people," Jim said quietly, turning the locket over in his fingers. "I hated what I used to be. I hated that being her son meant I came from nothing, and I spent 50 years making sure nobody could ever say that about me again." Lily took his hand, the way she always did, without hesitation, without any sense that his confession should change how she felt about him. "I think what you used to be sounds like someone brave," she said. "I think your mom sounds like someone who loved you a whole lot." Jim looked at her for a long moment, this small, unafraid girl who had walked into his darkest room and simply refused to leave it, and understood, with a kind of grief he hadn't expected, that his mother would have loved this child instantly and without reservation, exactly the way he was slowly learning to. He opened the box fully for the first time in years and let Lily look through it with him, page by page, photograph by photograph, the two of them piecing together a woman neither of them had ever properly been allowed to know until now. Outside the study window, the estate's gardens sat overgrown and neglected, the same gardens Elena had once told her young son she dreamed he might build for himself someday. Jim looked out at them now and, for the first time, thought seriously about what it might mean to finally bring them back to life. "Can I meet her?" Lily asked, still holding one of the old photographs carefully by its edges. "Not really meet her. But can you tell me more about her? What was her favorite thing to do?" Jim thought for a long moment, surprised by how far back he had to reach for the memory, and how clearly it came anyway once he found it. "She used to hum while she worked. Old songs, ones she never told me the names of. I used to fall asleep some nights listening to her hum through the wall of whatever small room we were staying in that year. I haven't thought about that sound in decades." "Maybe you could hum it," Lily suggested. "Maybe your hands remember even if your brain doesn't." Jim almost laughed at the simplicity of it, the way only a child could suggest something that strange and have it somehow make perfect sense. He closed his eyes and tried, and after a moment, a few uncertain notes came out of him, rough and unpracticed, but unmistakably a melody, something that had been sitting dormant inside him for 50 years waiting for someone brave enough to ask him to find it again. Lily smiled and rested her head against his arm, humming along even though she'd never heard the tune before in her life, simply matching the shape of his voice the way children do, out of love rather than accuracy. Rachel found them like that an hour later, Jim still holding the old photographs, Lily curled against him, both of them humming something soft and unfamiliar into the fading afternoon light, and she stood in the doorway a long moment before either of them noticed her, unwilling to be the one to end it. The medical tests Rachel had quietly pushed for came back within the week, and they confirmed everything her instincts had been trying to tell her for a month. Jim's heart medication had been steadily reduced, dose by careful dose, and quietly supplemented with sedatives strong enough to keep him weak without ever appearing dangerous on paper. It wasn't an accident and it wasn't a single mistake. It was a pattern, deliberate and sustained, timed with unsettling precision around the visits of one particular family member. The investigation that followed led directly to Richard. "It was mercy," Richard said when he was finally confronted, his voice flat, almost bored, as though the accusation itself were an inconvenience rather than a confession. No one in the room believed him, least of all Jim, who sat listening from his wheelchair with an expression that had gone somewhere far beyond anger and settled instead into something quieter and far more painful. The truth was simpler and uglier than mercy. Richard had wanted his father's estate settled before Jim's recovery gave him time to change the will, before Lily and Rachel and whatever they represented could complicate the tidy inheritance he'd been counting on for years. Jim said nothing for a long time after Richard was let out of the house by the two investigators who had been quietly building the case alongside Rachel's photographs and records. It wasn't the illness that had nearly killed him twice now. It was the confirmation of something he had feared his entire adult life and never allowed himself to say out loud, that he had never truly been loved by his own blood, only tolerated for what he could eventually leave behind when he was gone. Lily climbed into the chair beside him that evening and rested her head quietly against his arm, saying nothing for a long while, simply staying, the way she had promised to from the very first afternoon in the dark. "I'm still your family," she finally said. "Rachel is too. We're not waiting for anything except you to get better." Jim closed his eyes, one hand resting over hers, and let himself believe her. That night, alone in his study long after Lily had gone to bed, Jim sat with his lawyer on the phone and began, for the first time in his adult life, to rewrite his will completely, not out of anger at Richard, though the anger was there, but out of a clearer sense than he'd had in decades of who in this house had actually shown up for him when it mattered. He thought of Elena scrubbing floors before dawn so he could have a future. He thought of Rachel, driving through a flooded storm to save a man who had barely been kind to her. He thought of Lily, unafraid in a dark room when the rest of the world had already given up on him. For the first time in 50 years, Jim Springer understood exactly what he wanted the rest of his life, however much of it remained, to actually stand for. Richard called once, 2 days after the police had escorted him from the property, his voice tight with something that might have been fear or might simply have been the fresh discomfort of consequences finally catching up to him. "You can't cut me out entirely," Richard said. "I'm your son. Whatever you think of what happened, that doesn't change." "No," Jim said quietly. "It doesn't. You'll still be provided for. I'm not interested in punishing you the way you were willing to let me suffer. But you will not control anything again. Not while I'm alive and not after I'm gone. Because of the housekeeper's kid? You're rewriting 50 years of family because a 6-year-old held your hand a few times?" Jim was quiet for a moment, turning the question over the way he turned over most things now, slowly, without the old impatience that used to color everything he touched. "She didn't rewrite anything," he finally said. "She just showed me what I'd been missing long before she ever walked into that room. You had every opportunity to be that for me, Richard. You chose the trust documents instead. I can't make you sorry about that. I can only decide what I do with whatever time I've got left." Richard didn't have an answer for that. The line went quiet and then it went dead, and Jim sat alone in his study for a long while afterward, not triumphant, not even particularly angry anymore, just tired in the specific way that comes from finally putting down something you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten it had weight. Lily found him there an hour later and didn't ask what had happened. She simply climbed up beside him the way she always did and stayed. Rachel came looking for her a while later and found the two of them sitting quietly in the dim study, Lily's head resting against Jim's arm, neither of them speaking. She hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to interrupt. "You can come in," Jim said without turning. "You're not intruding. You never have been, actually. I just wasn't ready to admit that until recently." Rachel stepped inside and sat in the chair across from him. "How are you feeling? About Richard, I mean." Jim considered the question honestly, the way he'd started considering most things lately. "Strangely lighter," he admitted. "I spent so many years afraid of exactly this, of my own son wanting me gone. Now that I know for certain, there's nothing left to be afraid of. Just grief. Grief is quieter than fear. I can live with grief." "You don't have to decide everything about the will tonight," Rachel said gently. "You've had a long week." "I know what I want," Jim said. "I've known for longer than I've been willing to say out loud. I just needed someone to prove to me it was real before I let myself believe it." He looked at Lily, who had fallen half asleep against his arm, and then at Rachel, sitting across from him with the same steady, unglamorous loyalty she'd shown since the day she walked through his gates with an eviction notice folded in her back pocket and nothing left to lose. "Thank you," he said, the words unfamiliar and a little rough in his mouth, like a muscle finally being used after decades of disuse. "Both of you. For staying when you didn't have to." Jim gathered his lawyers, his remaining family, Rachel, Lily, and the household staff into the estate's great hall, the same hall that had sat in near total darkness for over a decade, its curtains finally pulled open that morning for the occasion, sunlight spilling across furniture that hadn't seen daylight in years. Everyone in the room expected the ordinary kind of announcement. Billions divided along predictable, bloodline-shaped lines. Instead, Jim stood, with help, leaning on his cane, but he stood, which alone drew a quiet murmur through the room, and announced a complete education fund for Lily, covering every year of school she would ever need. He announced full ownership of the guest cottage for Rachel, transferred outright with no conditions attached. And then he announced the creation of the Elena Springer Foundation, named for his mother, dedicated to helping widows, struggling single mothers, and children exactly like the woman who had raised him and the little girl who had recently taught him how to feel again. For the first time in his life he told the room the true story of where he came from. "My mother's name was Elena," he said, his voice steady despite everything it cost him to say it out loud in front of people who had known him for decades without ever knowing this. "She scrubbed floors in other people's houses so that I could have an education. She wore one apron until there was more patch on it than fabric. And when I became successful, I did something I've never told anyone in this room. I erased her. I spent 50 years hiding the greatest woman I've ever known, because I was ashamed of what she'd given up so I could have everything I have now." He paused, looking out over the room at faces that had known only the cold, difficult version of him for years. "I was wrong," he said. "She wasn't something to hide. She was the only thing I ever had that was actually worth being proud of." The room fell completely silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, chairs scraped back and the room rose to its feet, staff and lawyers and even a few of the more distant relatives, applauding not out of obligation but because something in the room had genuinely shifted, in a way none of them could easily name. Rachel stood near the back with Lily's hand in hers, watching the man who had once demanded his coffee be remade 3 times in a single morning now stand in front of the people who mattered most and tell the truth about the woman who had made him possible. Lily tugged gently at her mother's sleeve. "Is Grandpa Jim happy now?" she whispered. Rachel looked at him, steady on his cane, tears in his eyes, applause rising around him in a house that hadn't heard applause in years, and smiled. "I think he's getting there, baby," she said. "I think he's finally getting there." After the room emptied and the lawyers had packed away their documents, Jim asked Rachel and Lily to stay behind. He wheeled himself slowly to the tall window at the end of the great hall, the one that looked out over the gardens, now cleared of a decade's overgrowth by a crew he'd hired the week before. "I want to build something out there," he said. "Not a monument. Something people can actually use. A place where children like Lily can come plant something and watch it grow instead of being told to stay quiet in someone else's house." "Elena's garden," Rachel said softly. "Elena's garden," Jim agreed. Lily tugged at his sleeve, pointing at a patch of bare earth near the old fountain. "Can we plant sunflowers? Like the ones in my drawing?" "Sunflowers," Jim said, and for the first time that entire long day he genuinely smiled, unguarded and easy, the kind of smile that had nothing to do with cameras or lawyers or the weight of a name he'd spent 50 years protecting. I think that's exactly what she'd want. Rachel watched the two of them make plans for a garden neither of them had the strength yet to plant, sketching rough shapes in the dust on the windowsill with their fingers, and thought, not for the first time, that some of the biggest legacies in the world get built out of the smallest, most ordinary conversations. Before they left the hall that evening, one of the older staff members, a groundskeeper named Walter who had worked the estate for nearly 30 years, approached Jim hesitantly, cap in his weathered hands. "Mr. Springer, I don't mean to overstep," Walter said, "but I remember your mother. I was young when I started here, and she used to bring me tea in the mornings before the rest of the staff was even up. I never knew how to say anything about her after she left. Nobody talked about her. I always wondered what happened." Jim looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. "You knew her?" "Everyone who worked the early shifts knew her, sir. She was kind to people nobody else bothered being kind to. I always hoped you knew that about her." "I do now," Jim said quietly. "It took me far too long, but I do now." Walter nodded, clearly relieved, and excused himself, leaving Jim standing at the window with Rachel and Lily a while longer, watching the last light fade behind the gardens that would, within the month, bear his mother's name in careful lettering on a stone marker near the fountain. 1 year later, the curtains at the Springer estate were open for the first time in over a decade, and they stayed that way. Children's laughter echoed through hallways that had once only known silence, part of the foundation's new mentorship program that brought struggling families onto the grounds twice a week for tutoring, meals, and the kind of quiet support Elena Springer had once desperately needed and never received. The Elena Springer Foundation had already changed hundreds of lives in its first year. Rent covered for families on the edge of eviction, tuition paid for children who might otherwise have had to leave school, mothers given the kind of second chance Rachel herself had once been handed by a stranger on the other end of a phone call. Rachel directed the foundation full-time now, a job she approached with the same quiet, relentless competence she'd once brought to scrubbing floors and swallowing pride in a house that hadn't wanted her. Lily attended a school she loved, and every single afternoon without fail she came home and read to Jim in the library that used to be dark, the same library she had once wandered into uninvited in a bright yellow dress. Elena's portrait hung in the entrance hall now, restored and dignified, finally seen by everyone who walked through the front door instead of hidden away in a locked wooden box. Beside it, framed in simple gold, hung Lily's very first drawing. A house, a yellow sun, 2 words written carefully at the top in a 6-year-old's uneven hand. "My grandpa." One evening, as the two of them sat together in the library while the sun went down over the gardens Jim had spent the past year slowly restoring, he finally asked her the question that had sat quietly with him for nearly a full year. "Why weren't you ever afraid of me?" he asked. "Everyone else was. 12 caregivers quit before your mother ever arrived. My own son could barely stand to be in the room with me. But you walked right in like none of it mattered." Lily thought about it the way she thought about everything, completely, honestly, without rushing toward an easy answer. "Because sad people don't need fear," she said finally. "They need someone to stay." Jim reached over and took her small hand in his, the same trembling hand she had held that very first afternoon in the dark, back when he'd been a man waiting to die and she'd been a little girl who simply hadn't been told yet that some people were supposed to be avoided. He looked out across the gardens his mother had once only dared to dream about from the wrong side of someone else's fence, gardens that were now green and blooming and entirely his own family's to enjoy, and he smiled. Not because he had billions. He'd had billions for decades and they had never once made him smile like this. He smiled because for the first time in his long life, he finally had a family, not the one he'd been born into, and not the one that had waited quietly and patiently for him to die. The one he'd been given instead by a maid's daughter who refused to be afraid of him, and a mother who refused to let either of them go. Outside, in the garden that had once been nothing but dead vines and broken glass, rows of sunflowers stood taller than Lily now, their heavy yellow heads turned toward the last of the evening light exactly the way Elena had once described them to a young son who never forgot the image even as he tried for 50 years to forget everything else. Rachel joined them on the library steps as the sky deepened into gold, carrying 3 mugs of tea, and sat down beside Jim without needing to be invited, the way family does. Lily leaned into her mother on one side and kept her other hand resting in Jim's, unwilling even now, a full year later, to let go of the habit that had started this entire story. "Tell us the story again," Lily said, the way she asked most evenings now, even though she already knew every word of it. "Which story?" Jim asked, though he already knew too. "The one about the little girl who wasn't afraid." Jim looked out at the sunflowers, at the gardens his mother had only ever been allowed to dream about, at the woman beside him who had once been a stranger sent to care for a man everyone had already given up on, and at the small girl who had walked into his darkest room in a bright yellow dress and simply refused to leave. "Once upon a time," he began, his voice steady, warm, entirely unlike the man who had once demanded silence and darkness in every room of this house, "there was a very sad old man who thought he was going to die alone." Lily smiled and settled in against his arm to listen, the way she had every evening for the past year, and the house behind them, full of laughter and open curtains and a family built from nothing but two people who had refused to walk away, sat quiet and warm in the fading light. Some people spend their whole lives building fortunes. Others spend their whole lives building walls. Jim Springer did both. It took one little girl with a sketchbook, a yellow dress, and a heart too innocent to recognize bitterness, to tear those walls down for good. If this story moved you, you know exactly what to do. Drop a comment if you believe the smallest hands can hold the heaviest hearts. Hit like, follow for the next story and share this with someone who needs reminding. It's never too late to come home.